right, we're dealing tonight with Joshua chapter 22. Joshua chapter 22 is where we are. Next week will be Joshua 23, and then the following week 24, and then we'll have one more week beyond that, and it'll be a review and tie some loose ends together of the book of Joshua. And then we'll be ready to jump into Judges in the next trimester. Let's review where we've been. And this is a review of the chapters, and this is more than just time filler. Hopefully what this does is keep reminding us of what these chapters are about, and that this keeps putting that further and further into our memory. Chapter 1 dealt with the Joshua prepares for the conquest. Chapter 2, the spies were sent to Jericho. And then chapter 3 was the crossing over the Jordan. And then chapter 4 was the memorial stones that were placed in two different places. There's a reminder of that, I think, even in principle, of some things that we're going to see in our study tonight. Then there was the second generation that was circumcised in chapter 5. So those 5 chapters gets us across the Jordan River. Now we're ready for the conquest. So in chapter 6, there was the taking of Jericho. There was the failure in chapter 7 at Ai. They failed to take Ai because of Achan's sin. And then there is the victory at Ai in chapter 8. Chapter 9 is the treaty with the Gibeonites. Chapter 10, the conquest of the south, the southern campaign as we call it. And then chapter 11 was the northern campaign, and that basically is the complete campaign. Now there's the settling out of the land. And so starting in chapter 12, we have the kings enumerated that Moses conquered and those that Joshua conquered. And now we start into chapter 13, the division of the land. And so we have the division of the land on the east. We have the division of the land on the west. And the land in Caleb inherits at Hebron. Chapter 15 was the land that was given to Judah. Chapter 16, the land that was given to Ephraim. This is still on the west. And the land that was given to Manasseh, half a tribe of Manasseh, and to Benjamin, 18. And then we have the rest of those tribes in chapter 19. Then when we come to chapter 20, we have the cities of refuge. And then we have the cities that were given to the Levites in chapter 21. So that catches us up to chapter 22 now. Where does it fit? We're in the section of claiming the inheritance. We've looked at crossing the river, conquering the enemy. And now we're still claiming the inheritance. And though that's all been settled out, here's some things that are being done in the final closing chapters. We have the border tribes allotted, as Wiersbe outlines that. I'll word that a little differently, but we're following his overall outline. And then we're going to talk in chapters 23 and 24. In 2 lessons, we'll talk about the final admonition that Joshua gives, and very practical admonition that is. Now, here are the tribes on our map that we've been focusing on after they've all been settled, and this is where everybody is, their allotment is. So our focal point tonight, if you hadn't got a chance to read ahead, and hopefully you did, is focusing over here on a half a tribe of Manasseh and Gad and Reuben, those that are on the east side of the Jordan River. Now remember, in Numbers chapter 32, there was an agreement, and we'll go back to that in a few moments, that there was an agreement when they wanted to keep this land on this side. Moses made an agreement if they'd go across, and now they're getting to come back and occupy the land. We'll say more about that here in just a moment. Let's get underway with chapter 22 now. In answer to question number 1, the short summary of chapter 22 would simply be the eastern tribes return and they build an altar. Those 2 things happen in chapter 22. So these eastern tribes, that is, there's 2.5 tribes. There was Reuben, Gad, and a half a tribe of Manasseh. They go back to the land. Now, that doesn't mean nobody has been in that territory. If you want to make a marginal note, Numbers 32, and you might turn back there just briefly. Let's get a picture of what's going on and why that's going on in Numbers chapter 32. You remember when they came to the Jordan ready to cross over Jordan, they had conquered King Sihon and Og, and there were some of the children of Israel wanted to stay on that side and that be their land. That was good land on that side. And I'm just paraphrasing. We don't have time to read all of Numbers chapter 32. But we simply call that, if you wrote down chapter titles as we were going through that, here are tribes that settled on the east side. And they made an appeal to Moses, let's settle and keep some of this land on this side. And Moses rebuked them at verse 6, shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? In other words, y'all want to occupy this land? Is that what you're wanting? And the rest of them go and have to fight and you not fight? And the agreement was made if the fighting men would go over and fight until all the land was settled, and then they could come back. Now, I mentioned chapter 32 just for two reasons. To give you a reference of what we're talking about, you might want to make a marginal note at Joshua 22. And the second reason is to suggest to you, not everybody in those tribes went across, only the fighting men. And so there were women and non-fighting men and children that stayed behind and occupied the land, while their fighting men were the ones that went over and they fought. Those are the ones that have been gone. How long have they been gone? Well, approximately 7 years. We've talked about that earlier. We won't go back and trace that reference, but we talked about how long it took to settle out the land and conquer all the land, to have that central campaign in the southern, then the northern campaign, and then settle all the tribes. Approximately 7 years it took. Now, that being the case, these fighting men have been gone for about 7 years, and now they're ready to go back home. So we have two things that happen in chapter 22. We have the return, verses 1 to 9, and they built an altar, and verses 10 to 34, and that's our study in our chapter. So let's start with the return and Joshua's instructions in verses 1 to 6 now. Joshua's instructions in verses 1 to 6. Unlike our previous 4 or 5 chapters wherein the chapters just simply dealt with this tribe occupied this territory from this river to this city, include this city and this city, and this tribe occupied this, and this. This has got some very practical flow of teaching that's involved. So let's see what that is. Joshua begins to speak, and Joshua called the Reubenites and the Gadites and half a tribe of Manasseh. That's the 2.5 tribes we've been talking about. And he tells them, you have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice and all that I command you. In other words, you two tribes have been faithful to your leader Moses while he was your leader. But since Moses has been gone and I am now the leader, you've been faithful to follow my leadership and my direction. So you faithfully kept all the commandments of the past. Now go on in verse 3. And you have not left your brethren these many days. You've not left your brethren these many days. That many days would be about 7 years. Up to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. Now that's where Numbers 32 comes in. That is the agreement Moses said, if you'll go across and fight, then you can occupy and keep this land. But you've got to go across and fight first. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. That's not the exact wording of that. But Numbers 32 fits in at verse 3. So in verses 1 to 3, he said he commends them for their past obedience. You were faithful to the leadership of Moses. You've been faithful to my leadership. And particularly in this matter of agreement of going across and fighting, you went across and you fought to the end until the land was conquered. And now it's time to do something else. Now at verse 4, he tells them to return to their land now. And he calls it rest. That's interesting because that's the same terminology that we're going to see in chapters 3 and 4 of the book of Hebrews. We'll say more about that in a moment. But look at verse 4. But now the Lord your God has given rest to your brethren as he promised them. Now therefore return and go to your tents and the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. Now, he makes an emphasis and a play on this word rest. Hebrews chapter 3, without turning there, and chapter 4 talks about that those who came out of Egypt didn't make it into the promised land. They didn't make it into their rest. They did not enter in their rest. Only Joshua and Caleb were the ones who, of that original group that came out, made it into the promised land. At least among the fighting men is the point. So the point is that there was a rest remaining for the people of God. They didn't enter their rest. But now when we get to verse 4, though, those that are now living, that is, these didn't originally come out of Egypt. They were born in the wilderness and raised. And they made it into their rest now, meaning they're resting in the land. They've come through the wilderness, they conquered the land, and now they're resting, that the land is theirs. So his point is, now you go and enter into your rest on the other side of the Jordan, the land that was given to you by Moses. You go over there and you occupy that. Now verse 5 is interesting. Let's take some time to analyze verse 5. Verse 5, he exhorts them to continued obedience. You have been obedient in the past. Now he tells them, you go into your rest, but your obedience doesn't stop at that. You need to continually obey the Lord. But take diligent heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways, and to keep his commandments, and hold fast to him, and serve him with all your heart and all your soul. Now let's analyze verse 5. There's several practical things that we learn from verse 5. And let's take a look at verse 5, some things we learn. At ages, this is one of the things you're looking for. In fact, question 2 for the adults is find 5 expressions in verse 5 that suggest dedication and devotion. And let's see what they are. Look at verse 5 now. This is, now get the context. You have been faithful and diligent in the past. Now go enter into your rest. But your rest over there means that you're resting from the fighting. It doesn't mean you rest from obedience. There needs to be continual obedience. And here's 5 things. First of all, he said, take careful heed to do the commandment of that Moses had given to you, the commandment of the Lord. So here's diligence, heeding to the commandment of the Lord. Pulpit suggests that that's probably taken from several references in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6 and 5, and then the host of others that follow on. All through the book of Deuteronomy, Moses was preaching, and Joshua was there hearing that there needs to be careful obedience. Be careful to obey. Be careful to obey. Be careful. That word's used all throughout. We called attention to that when we were studying Deuteronomy. So he's preaching the same thing Moses did. Now you're about to enter into your rest. Take careful heed. Don't just take heed, but take careful heed. Diligent heed. So there needs to be diligent heed to do the commands. Secondly, to love the Lord your God. Everyone who claimed to be a follower of God truly loved the Lord their God. If they truly loved the Lord their God, they would not have turned into idols. If they truly loved the Lord their God, they wouldn't turn back, want to go back to Egypt. But he tells them to truly love the Lord their God. Thirdly, to walk in all his ways. Not in some of his ways or most of his ways, but to walk in all of his ways. And the history of Israel is that they would walk in the ways of God, but they didn't walk in all the ways of God. They'd only walk in the ways that they wanted to. For example, in the day of the judges, as we're about to get into, at the conclusion of Joshua, every man did that which is right in his own eyes. Over and over again, that principle is taught in the book. Twice, that exact phrase is used in the book of Judges. Every man did that which is right in his own eyes. So they weren't walking in all of his ways. Fourthly, they were to hold fast to him. In other words, here is this clinging to the Lord as if he's about to get away. Hold fast to him. And then finally, number 5, serve him with all your heart and all your soul. That reminds us of Deuteronomy 6. So it does seem, as Pulpit suggests, that he's almost paraphrasing a summary of what the book of Deuteronomy was about. If you want a good summary of what Moses had been trying to preach to these people, read verse 5, because that's what Deuteronomy was about. That they need to carefully obey, to love the Lord, walk in all of his ways, hold fast to him, and serve him with all of their heart. That's a sermon within itself, isn't it? All right. So that's your answer to question number 2. And Grady Ages, your answer to one side of your handout is found right there on that slide. Now let's go back to our outline and get verse 6 now. We're still talking about Joshua's instruction. So let's get verse 6, and then we summarize what he just said. At verse 6, so Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. They went back home. Their family is there. They have family waiting there because, as we've already mentioned, Exodus 32 suggested only the fighting men went across. So they have family waiting for them, and they go back to their tents. So what did we see in 1 to 6? Joshua said, you've been obedient in the past. Now what you need to do is go and be rewarded for that, because Moses said you could go back, and so you're going back now. Continue obedience and that faithfulness and diligence, and don't give up, and you press on. And then he blessed them and sent them off. All right. Now then, let's get 7 to 9. They return with much possessions. In other words, they go back and they're able to take part of the spoils with them as they make their way back across. Now, the half a tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan, but to the other half, Joshua gave possession among their brethren on this side of Jordan. On this side always has reference to the west side of Jordan. So on this side of Jordan, westward was given by Joshua, and indeed when Joshua sent them to their tents, he blessed them. So here's the point, that half of the tribe was assigned part of their land on the east side by Moses, but the other half was assigned that by Joshua. Now, at verse 8, that he spoke to them and said, return with much riches to your tent. We have a question here. Question number 3, what did the eastern tribe take back with them? Well, here's our answer at verse 8. They took much riches with them, and here's the list of the things. They took livestock, silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and very much clothing, and he told them to divide the spoils of your enemies with your brethren. Now, where'd they get all of that? Well, from the spoils of their enemies. So they were not supposed to take anything from the city of Jericho, you remember, but they were allowed to take the spoils from Ai, and other cities as well. So as they conquered those cities, they were able to take the spoils. They gained clothing because they were to slaughter the people, so they gained clothing, they gained their silver, they gained their gold, their iron, etc. So there's a lot of rich possessions they have. So they're going back home, taking a lot of possessions with them. Verse 9, now to finish that section. So the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the half a tribe of Manasseh, they returned and departed from Shiloh. That's home base. At least at the moment, it's home base. Jerusalem ultimately will be, but that's home base. That's where the tabernacle will be at this point. And so they leave from there, and which is in the land of Canaan, and they went to the country of Gilead, which is where the half a tribe of Manasseh would be. And there they took possession, which they possessed according to the word of the Lord by the hand of Moses. Now, you might underline that phrase. That's an interesting phrase to me. That all throughout, in fact, we saw this at verse 4, and we see it again at verse 9, according to the commandment, according to the word by the hand of Moses. In other words, according to the promise. We see all through this, God had made promises through Moses. You're going to get this land. And so they're going back and receiving that land. And I think that's a reference probably to Numbers 32 again. Moses had said, if you go across and fight, you can come back and possess this land. I'm giving it to you. And so this is the fulfillment of that. And so God kept any promise that was made through Moses. So that's the return now. That gets us through verse 9. Joshua gave them instructions. They returned with much possessions. Now let's move further and talk about this altar that was built. Then having done that, we're going to look at some practical things before we get through. So verse 10 tells us that the eastern tribe, those 2.5 tribes, they built an altar, the text says. And let's see what happens here. There's 4 things that we're going to see happen in these verses 10 through 34. But here's what happens with the eastern tribe. It says, when they came to the region of the Jordan, which is in the land of Canaan, the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and a half a tribe of Manasseh built an altar there by Jordan, a great and impressive altar. Now, if you've read your lesson, you know as we get further what that was. If you jump over to verse 22, it was a replica or a copy according to the pattern of the altar of the temple, or the tabernacle rather, and where they would offer their burnt offerings and their sacrifices. But this one was a great and an impressive altar. When I say according to the pattern, it may have been fashioned like it. It may have been, though I'm not sure, that it may have been larger than that altar, but it was a great and impressive altar, the text says. Now, where was that built? Well, we're going to see that starting at verse 11. The western tribes hear about this. They hear a rumor, and they react to that. So here's the report. The text says at verse 11, the children of Israel heard someone say, someone had been supplied by translators, but they heard say, or someone say, that's implied. In other words, someone come running to the children of Israel and told them, and I take it that it wasn't one of the children of Israel, that it was some of the people still left in the land that needed to be driven out, that hadn't yet been driven out, but nonetheless, someone come running and told them, behold, the children of Reuben and Gad and half a tribe of Manasseh have built an altar on the frontier, or literally the front of the land of Canaan, in the region of Jordan occupied by the children of Israel. In other words, they built that just before they crossed over the river. In other words, it was built not on their side, but it's built on the western side. Not built on the east side, but on the western side. And so it was built on the frontier of the Jordan River and in the land that was occupied by the children of Israel. And so they're ready to make war. Now, so that's where the altar was built. Just before they cross over, they build this altar. There's a purpose for that, as you know. But if you haven't read ahead, we begin to wonder, what's this all about? Well, whoever was reporting this reports it as if they seem to be setting up an altar where they're going to worship a different kind of worship. Then they're not going to come back over and worship. They seem to be dividing the nation. That's not the case at all. They hear the report. Now, verse 12. Verse 12, they're ready to make war. Now, why are they ready to make war? Well, let's see. That when the children of Israel heard it, the whole congregation of the children of Israel gathered together at Shiloh to go to war against them. Now, why did they go to war? Why didn't they just send a messenger and say, look, y'all shouldn't do this. Let's find out what you're doing. Tell us what this is all about. What's the purpose behind that? What are your plans for it? They didn't send a messenger. They sent a delegation ready to declare war on them. Now, why would they declare war on them? Well, as we're going to see when we get to verses 13 through 20, they think they have assumed. We're learning a lesson about assumption here. They have assumed that these 2.5 tribes are rebelling against God. Not just against the other tribe, but rebelling against God. The fear is, as going to be expressed by Phinehas, is that if they rebel, God is going to punish the whole nation. So we don't want to be punished. So they run and get quick at making ready to punish the 2.5 tribes before God begins to break out in some kind of fiery trial among the people. That's what it's all about. It's protecting their own selves. That we don't want the wrath of God to come on us because of what y'all have done. Y'all are rebelling. We've seen rebellion before when a lot of people paid a price. I'm paraphrasing. That's what they're saying. A lot of people paid a price when a few rebelled, and we'll give you some for instances, Phinehas is saying. And we don't want that to happen again. So we're ready to punish you if you're rebelling against God. So let's get that. They're ready to make war. Starting at verse 13. They don't ask. This is interesting too. They don't go and ask, though they do word it, but they make charges. You are rebelling. Not are you rebelling, but you are rebelling. Now, let me just footnote here. And let's jump over to Proverbs just for a moment. That here's a principle that comes to play, I think, in Proverbs 18 and in verse 13. He that answers a matter before he hears it, it's folly and shame. Of taking a rumor, jumping to a conclusion, and running with that conclusion, ready to deal with the conclusion before you have all the facts. That's exactly what's going on here. Now let's get the picture, beginning at verse 13. Here's where we are in the outline. They charge the eastern tribes. That is, we're going to see who charges them with rebellion, starting at verse 13. They first of all got to band together. The children of Israel sent Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest. He's the high priest at the moment, so he's a descendant of Aaron. And this is the son of Eleazar, the priest, to the children of Reuben, to the children of Gad, and half a tribe of Manasseh, and they sent a ruler, 10 rulers, one from each chief house of the children of Israel. They're 9.5 tribes. So you take the 9 tribes, they send one, and that half tribe sends one, that makes 10. That's where they got the 10. And according to the vision of the house of Israel, so they took the 10, and they sent Phinehas, and they send them off, this group off to the 2.5 tribes. Now at verse 15, when they came to the children of Reuben, to the children of Gad and half tribe of Manasseh, they spoke to them saying, here's their charge. Thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what treachery is this that you have committed against the God of Israel to turn away this day from following the Lord? And we'll finish that verse in a moment. Notice this word treachery. It's an unfaithful act. They're charging them with unfaithfulness. Not what have you done, explain this altar, but you have committed treachery. You are guilty of an unfaithful act. And here's your intent by so doing. You're intending to turn away this day from following the Lord, and you built an altar for yourselves. Furthermore, the charge says, why do you rebel this day against the Lord? So that basically is the charge. You're committing treachery, you're rebelling against God, and you built an altar. In other words, you're not wanting to come back and worship over here at Shiloh or ultimately at Jerusalem. You see, Deuteronomy 12 said God would choose a place for them to worship. You're disregarding that. You're making your own place of worship. We heard about the altar. We've been told about that. And that's the charge. Now, if that's true, the rest of the speech is pretty good. But it wasn't true. So look at verse 17. Is the iniquity of Peor not enough for us? Now let's stop there and we'll finish that verse in a moment. What's he talking about, the iniquity of Peor? Well, let's go back to Numbers 25. This is the event and the occasion. In other words, do you not remember when we were in the wilderness and what happened to the children of Israel at Peor? Was that not enough? That we've got to have more problems like this? This is where Israel committed harlotry in Moab with the women of Moab. And notice that according to beginning at verse 6, that one brought a harlot into his tent in front of the congregation, in front of Moses. And verse 9, and that day, and those who died in the plague were 24,000. 1 Corinthians mentions this. Psalm 106 mentions that. Now, let's go back to Joshua 22. You are guilty of rebellion. You've rebelled against God. What I want to know, Phinehas is saying, I want to know, was the problem that we had at Peor, was that not enough that we lost 24,000? Not all 24,000 were involved in the sin, but the plague broke out and 24,000 died, so others suffered as a consequence of what some were doing. You see the point, what they're driving at? Because of what y'all are doing, we may suffer in that. That's why we're ready to go to war with you. And was that not enough? Now notice the rest of verse 18, verse 17. From which we are not cleansed unto this day. What does that mean? I don't know. But I think it means that we hadn't got over that yet, to paraphrase. For example, we may go on with life, but there's a number of things we haven't got over. The attack of 9/11 on the Trade Center, we ain't got over that yet. So if somebody begins to do something that calls the terrorists to attack us again, someone may raise a question. Was 9/11 not enough? I mean, did there not enough people die in that we need more people die? Is that what you want? I think he's saying we ain't got over that yet. That we're still suffering from that loss of 24,000. Was that not enough? That you want to create more problems? Powerful point he's making. Although there was a plague in the congregation of the Lord, but that you must turn away this day from following the Lord, and it shall be, if you rebel today against the Lord, there's again the charge of rebellion, that tomorrow he'll be angry with the whole congregation of Israel. That's their concern. Just like happened at Peor, is very likely going to happen now. God's had a history when somebody commits sin, he ends up punishing a lot more than just the person who, in other words, others suffer consequence of that. But he's not through. Notice at verse 19, he raises the question, what's the problem here? If the land of your possession is unclean, is that the problem? I'm paraphrasing. Is it that the land that you're going to go back to, is that unclean land? You acted like you wanted it before we came over and started fighting, but now that you're going back, you act like you want to build an altar over here on this side, just across the river. Is your land unclean? Is that the problem? If so, then instead of setting up a different altar, come over on this side and we'll make room for you to live among us. That's the point of verse 19. But do not rebel, I'm reading at the middle of verse 19, against the Lord, nor rebel against us by building yourselves an altar besides the altar of the Lord our God. In other words, you have an addition to the Word of God. You have an addition to God's plan. You are rebelling against God is what you're doing. But he's not through. Here's his second case in point. Look, excuse me. Look at verse 20. Did not Achan, the son of Zerah, commit a trespass in the accursed thing, and wrath fell on the congregation of Israel, and that man did not perish alone in his iniquity? Well, you're familiar with that. That's Joshua 7. You remember Achan was the man. The whole congregation didn't partake of the accursed thing, but Achan did, and the whole congregation was held back, and 36 men died because of that. Two cases in point where a few or one sinned and others suffered consequences. We don't want to suffer by your rebellion. That's why we're ready to punish you with war. And so that's his point. That's his speech. He's done with his speech. He's over. And that's the Western tribes. They hear and they react with that charge. We're ready to fight you in all of that. Well, now we're ready for this. Here's verses 21 to 29. The Eastern tribes explain. Here's what we were doing. Here's what our motive is. Here's what it's not to rebel or to turn away. In other words, you're wrong in your charge. This is not treachery. This is not rebellion. We're not wanting to worship in a different place. That's not what we're doing. Look at verse 21 now. The Lord God of gods, the Lord of gods. He knows, and let Israel know himself. Let me paraphrase basically what I think he's saying, or what they are saying. God knows our hearts. If God knows my heart, my God knows what our true motive was. And you need to know what our motive is. If it is rebellion or if it is treachery against the Lord, do not save us this day. May we pay the price. And if we built ourselves an altar to turn from following the Lord, or to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it, let the Lord himself require an account. In other words, you finesse. You're saying that when people rebelled, they suffered and paid a price. And somebody else sinned and rebelled and they paid a price. If ours is rebellion, then let the price come on. We're willing to pay the price. Let God bring his consequence on. That's not what we're doing. That was not our motive. We're not building an altar on which to offer sacrifice. We're not building an altar on which to put our burnt offering. We're not doing that. But if it is rebellion and God's going to punish someone, then let him bring it on and punish us now, because that's not what we're doing. God knows our motive. All right, verse 24. So what are you doing then? But in fact, we have done it for fear. Is there any man present that's got a different translation that sheds more light on it? I meant to go back and check that word. For fear, or the footnote says because or from fear. We did it from fear. Fear of what? We'll get to that in a moment. Is there another word that's used? Which translation? Read the verse for me. I've lost my place. I was hoping you knew. Verse 24. All right. That's good. Good. Thank you. We were doing this out of fear or worry. What were you fearful of? Well, he's about to tell us about the next generation. We know some things, you know some things, but we're worried about the next generation. What are they going to think? What is their conclusion? And we were thinking ahead. So you might underline that word for fear. And let me footnote to say, and we'll get to the practical thing, sometimes we need to do things out of fear of what the next generation may think. It's a powerful point. In time to come, I'm reading at verse 24, your descendants may speak to our descendants, saying, what have you done, what have you to do with the Lord God of Israel? In other words, your children, let's go down a next generation after that. What when your grandchildren or great-grandchildren come across the great-grandchildren of the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half the tribe of Manasseh, who are on the other side of the Jordan, what do y'all have to do with the worship over here on this side of Jordan? For the Lord God has made the Jordan a border between you and us. Whether we reckon, unless you've lived in an area where there is a river close by, sometimes a river creates a major barrier mentally. I lived in two places where there's a river close by, and it's like you could drive 20 miles in this direction to go somewhere, but you can't drive 2 miles and go across the river because that's too far. There's a mental barrier there somehow. And they're going to ask, what's the difference between those Israelites over there and those Israelites over here? There's a barrier between you of the Jordan River. And you have no part with the Lord, so your descendants would make our descendants cease fearing the Lord. I don't know that it's saying, now, and that's a tough phrase, the phrasing of verse, so your descendants make our descendants cease fearing the Lord. I take it that would discourage them. And by saying, y'all are on that side of the river and we're over here, what do y'all have? We worship over here in the tabernacle or in the temple at Jerusalem, and what do y'all have to do with us? I don't know the history of all of this, so what do y'all have to do with us? Do y'all not come over here and worship with us? Verse 26, therefore we said, this was our conclusion, prepare to build ourselves an altar, not for burnt offering or for sacrifice, but that it may be a witness, footnote will say testimony, that it may be a witness between you and us and our generations after us, that we may perform the service of the Lord with our burnt offerings, etc. Let's get the rest of verse 27, then we'll make a comment about that. That your descendants may not say to our descendants in the time to come, you have no part of the Lord. So this was all a part of a witness. Now, that was the fear that he talked about. In other words, it's going to serve as a reminder that the eastern tribes can come and worship over on the western side and worship where the rest of them do. And so when people see the memorial, what was this memorial about? Well, that was when those tribes went across, and this is a reminder. This is a reminder. That's what memorials do. It was more of a memorial or a witness and a reminder. That's what memorials do. They remind us of something. So that people ask, well, what's this all about? And you trace that and you begin to study on that. And somebody who knows nothing about World War II goes to Pearl Harbor and sees this memorial. And, well, what's this all about? Well, do your study and figure out what this memorial is all about. And then you come back and say, now I know what happened on December 7th, 1941. Well, that's what's going to happen here. Now, look at verse 28. What we're trying to do is prevent some problems. We were thinking of the next generation is what we were doing. So now verse 28. Therefore we said that it will be that when they say to us and to our generation in time to come, that here is the replica, my translation says, of the altar. The American Standard King James will say, behold the pattern. The English Standard says copy. In other words, this is the pattern. It's after the pattern, or it is a replica. I like that word replica, or a copy, the English Standard, of the original. It was likened to it. In order to remind people of the altar at Jerusalem, or at Shiloh now, and later will be at Jerusalem, that it's a replica of the altar of the Lord which our fathers made, though not for burnt offerings or for sacrifices, but it is a witness between you and us. So yes, we built an altar. You're right about that, Finesse, but you're wrong about your rebellion. It was not rebellion. It was not for making it for burning sacrifices. It was to serve as a witness and as a reminder to the generations to come. That's what it was all about. You're wrong in your assumption. Now, verse 29, to finish that section. So far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord, to turn from following, to build an altar for burnt offerings, for grain offerings, sacrifices, besides the altar that's before the tabernacle. In other words, we wouldn't think of doing that. In fact, we were thinking just the opposite of a memorial that would point back to going to Jerusalem or Shiloh. Now then, let's finish the chapter, 30 to 34. The western tribes are now pleased when everything's all clarified. So Phinehas, when Phinehas, the priest and the rulers of the congregation and the heads of the divisions heard these words, it pleased them. Verse 30. So Phinehas, the son of the Eleazar the high priest, said to the children of Reuben, children of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, this day we perceive that the Lord is among you, because you have not committed this treachery against the Lord. Now you have delivered the children of Israel out of the hand of the Lord. Now that's an interesting phrase. We thought you were headed toward rebellion and treachery, but we see that's not the case. But they go further than that. Notice this wording here. Now you have delivered the children of Israel out of the hand of the Lord. In other words, rather than bringing on wrath, that's what we thought you were doing. We thought you were about to bring God's wrath upon us. Rather than do that, it's just the opposite that you have accomplished. In other words, sometimes a misunderstanding isn't that there's a slight misunderstanding, it's the exact opposite of what you thought it was. And Phinehas is saying, this is exactly opposite of what I thought. I thought you were going against the Lord, but rather you're bringing the blessings of God upon us. That's what you're doing. Totally opposite of what I thought. Now verse 32 to 30 and 33. They report to the people, and they go back to the children of Israel and brought back word to them in verse 33. So it pleased the children of Israel, and the children of Israel blessed God. Notice what their reaction was. Rather than praising Phinehas for being such a negotiator, he worked this deal out. They turned and they blessed God. Praise God for that. And notice this, there was no more going against them in battle to destroy them. In other words, it put an end to the talk about war. Some were ready to go to war. I'm sure they were making plans. How are they going to attack? And from what direction they're going to attack? Do they need to hit the half a tribe of Manasseh or Gad or Reuben first? Where are they going to start? And how are they going to finish the war? That talk all ended, stopped. Now verse 34. Verse 34 said they called the altar witness. The children of Reuben and children of Gad called the altar witness, for it is a witness between us that the Lord is God. In other words, it was testimony that both sides, both parts of the children of Israel, those on the west and those on the east, are going to worship God. It's where God so describes. All right, let's end by talking about some practical things from the chapter, and we'll be done. One of the things we learn here is striving for unity. They were striving for unity. Even though Phinehas was wrong in his assumption, that's what he was striving for. We need to be united. That's what they were striving for. That is Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh. Number three, number two, there is a pattern. There is a mold. If you're going to make something and follow the pattern, there's a pattern to follow. We need to think about what may develop in the future. In other words, we need to think about what our children, our grandchildren, what are they going to make of this circumstance, and how can we prevent their misunderstanding of something? And that's exactly what was going on. I learned a practical thing, that actions are often misunderstood. People who have the greatest of motive, doing the right thing, are misinterpreted and accused of doing wrong at times. A well-intended action for unity could be mistaken. Explanation makes a big difference. It did. Purpose and motive makes all the difference. The question wasn't about building the altar, but what was your purpose in doing that? Well, our purpose was in witness. Well, that's a big difference than if your purpose was to offer burnt offerings on it. So purpose and motive makes a big difference. And the work done now makes a difference in the future. And it's better to get correct information before you go to battle. Again, Proverbs 18 and in verse 13. Very practical chapter. We're going to stop with that.